Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? We're taking a look at some seriously wild weather this time.
Yeah.
We've got that bomb cyclone brewing off the coast of the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And it's got a lot of folks thinking back to uh, that infamous Columbus Day storm back in 1962.
It really does. This is a fascinating opportunity to compare and contrast, these two powerful storms, almost like we've got a weather time machine.
Okay, so let's start with the basics, right? What exactly are we talking about when we say bomb cyclone? It sounds pretty intense.
It is. It's a storm that intensifies incredibly rapidly. So you see a dramatic drop in atmospheric pressure, at least 24 millibars in 24 hours or less.
Oh, wow.
And that drop, it acts like a giant vacuum cleaner. It sucks in air, creates those powerful winds that everyone's talking about.
Okay, so this current bomb cyclone, where is it right now? How strong are we expecting it to get?
Well, it's swirling off the coast right now, and predictions are saying it could reach about 950 millibars by Wednesday.
Wow.
That's a significant drop, could mean strong winds, maybe up to 70 miles per hour along the coast.
Okay, so we're talking down trees, power outages, the whole 9 yards.
Potentially, yeah.
All right, so we've got this current storm, but everyone keeps bringing up the 1962 Columbus Day storm. So where does that fit into all of this?
Well, the Columbus Day storm is considered the most powerful windstorm to ever hit the Pacific Northwest, in recorded history at least. It's really the benchmark for these types of events.
So this new storm is getting everyone to think about the Columbus Day storm.
Yeah.
Must have been something else. Paint us a picture. How bad was it?
Imagine you're in the Pacific Northwest. Suddenly, it feels like a hurricane has just slammed into the coast.
Oh, wow.
Winds howling, trees are snapping, rain's coming down sideways.
Oh, my gosh.
That was the reality for people who lived through the Columbus Day storm. And the damage was massive. We're talking somewhere between $230 and $280 million across a huge area, from California all the way up to British Columbia.
$280 million in damages.
Yeah.
And that was back in 1962. I mean, that's got to be like, what, $1 billion today?
Yeah, you're not wrong. Adjusting for inflation, the cost would be, well, astronomical. And the impact was widespread. Oregon alone saw an estimated $170 to $200 million in damages.
Wow.
To put it in perspective, it was comparable in cost to some of the hurricanes that hit the East Coast during that same period.
Okay, so we're talking hurricane-level impacts.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't a hurricane, that's crazy.
It is. And here's the thing. This wasn't even a typical Pacific Northwest storm. The Columbus Day storm formed in a really unusual way. It was actually the remnants of Typhoon Frida,
Typhoon.
merging with another powerful storm system right off the coast of California. We've never seen anything quite like it before or since in this region.
So typhoon from the Pacific slams into a storm brewing off the coast, and boom, you've got the most powerful windstorm in Pacific Northwest history.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see why people are making comparisons to this bomb cyclone we've got going on right now.
Exactly. Both storms involve that rapid intensification, and they both have the potential to cause significant damage. But let's dig into some of the data and see how they really measure up in terms of intensity.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What are some of the key data points that really stand out to you when you're comparing these two storms?
Well, one of the most important things to consider is pressure tendency. Basically, how quickly is the pressure dropping? A rapid drop indicates a storm that's intensifying really quickly, and that usually means stronger winds.
Okay, makes sense. So how does this current bomb cyclone's pressure drop compared to what happened back in 62?
Well, the Columbus Day storm had a record-setting average hourly pressure fall of 4.6 millibars per hour.
Wow.
That's an incredibly rapid intensification. Really helps explain why that storm was so powerful.
So 4.6 millibars per hour for the Columbus Day storm. Is the current storm dropping it at a similar rate?
Not quite. It is intensifying rapidly, but it's not matching that extreme pressure drop of the 1962 storm.
Interesting. So even though both are considered bomb cyclones, there are nuances in how quickly they're intensifying.
Yeah.
What about wind speeds? We've got those 70-mile-per-hour gusts predicted for this current storm. What kind of wind speeds did they see back in 62?
Oh, this is where things get really interesting. The wind speeds recorded during the Columbus Day storm were astonishing.
All right, give me some numbers.
For example, Newport, Oregon, recorded a peak gust of 138 miles per hour.
What?
Corvallis, Oregon, hit 127 miles per hour. And even inland in Portland, they clocked 116 miles per hour on the Morrison Bridge.
138 miles per hour. Those wind speeds sound absolutely terrifying.
It was a once-in-a-century event. For sure. And those high wind speeds led to some incredible stories.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of stories?
Well, there's one incident that always comes to mind. It happened at the weather station in Corvallis, Oregon, the same place that recorded that 127-mile-per-hour wind gust we were just talking about. As the storm was raging, the wind speeds just kept climbing higher and higher, and eventually the winds got so powerful that they actually had to abandon the weather station.
What?
Instruments were completely demolished. It's the only time in Pacific Northwest history that an official weather station had to be shut down because of high winds.
That is a wild story. It really puts the power of that 1962 storm into perspective.
It does, and it's a good reminder that even though we're dealing with a significant storm right now, that 1962 Columbus Day storm was truly in a league of its own.
So we've got this current bomb cyclone brewing off the coast, but the 1962 storm serves as this, like, almost mystical example of what Mother Nature can really unleash in the Pacific Northwest.
Absolutely.
I think we need to dig deeper into the impacts of both these storms to really understand what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
But let's save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Before we got sidetracked with that wild weather station story, we were in the middle of talking about how intense the wind speeds were during that 1962 Columbus Day storm.
Right, and it got me thinking, wind that strong has to cause some serious damage. So what were some of the biggest impacts of that storm, and are we expecting to see anything similar with this bomb cyclone we've got brewing right now?
One of the biggest impacts back in '62 was on the timber industry. That storm knocked down a crazy amount of trees, over 15 billion board feet of timber across the Pacific Northwest. It was an economic disaster.
15 billion. That's hard to even imagine. Are we expecting similar impacts on the timber industry from this current storm?
Well, it's important to remember that forest management practices have evolved significantly since 1962. There's much more emphasis now on sustainable forestry and reducing wildfire risk, and those practices actually help to make forests more resilient to wind damage as well.
Okay, so that's good news.
Yeah. So while a storm of that magnitude would undoubtedly still have a significant impact today, the timber industry is definitely in a much better position to mitigate some of that damage.
That's reassuring.
Right.
What about damage to other infrastructure? I know we're already hearing concerns about power outages and downed trees with this current storm. What kind of infrastructure damage did they see back in '62?
In 1962, the damage to infrastructure was widespread and pretty devastating. Homes and buildings were destroyed. Power outages lasted for days, sometimes weeks. Roads were blocked by debris. It's important to remember that this was before widespread use of cell phones and the internet.
Right.
Communication was severely disrupted, making it even harder to coordinate those recovery efforts.
It's amazing how much our reliance on technology has changed, in the past few decades.
Right.
If a storm like that were to hit today, I mean, the disruption to communications and infrastructure would be felt on a whole other level.
Absolutely. We're so much more interconnected today. So those cascading effects of a major storm could be even more widespread. And that's why it's so crucial to prepare for these events and have a plan in place.
Okay, so we talked about the potential impacts of these two storms, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about preparedness.
Sure.
What can we learn from the 1962 storm to help us get ready for this current bomb cyclone and, for future extreme weather events in general?
Well, one of the big lessons learned from '62 was the importance of early warning systems. Back then, weather forecasting wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today.
Right.
Many people were caught off guard by the storm's intensity because they just didn't have enough warning. And on top of that, there were major communication breakdowns, downed phone lines, power outages. It was incredibly difficult to get information out to the people who needed it most.
So these days, we've got more sophisticated forecasting tools and, a whole range of communication channels. Social media, text alerts, weather apps, all that. We're constantly bombarded with information, which can be a bit much sometimes, but it's a huge advantage when it comes to being prepared for a storm, right?
Absolutely. We're much better equipped now to track these storms, to get the word out quickly. But there's always room for improvement when it comes to public education and outreach.
Sure.
People need to understand the risks associated with these types of storms and have a plan in place before disaster strikes.
Right. So true. A little preparation can go a long way. So what are some practical things our listeners can do right now to get ready for this bomb cyclone?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Monitor weather updates from reliable sources like the National Weather Service. Pay attention to any warnings or advisories that are issued for your area, and don't rely on social media as your primary source of information. Go straight to the expert.
Okay, stay informed. What else?
Make sure you have an emergency kit ready to go. It should include essentials like water, non-perishable food, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, and a hand crank weather radio. It's also smart to have a full tank of gas in your car and some cash on hand just in case.
All great points. It's easy to forget those things when you're not in the middle of an emergency. Anything else we should be thinking about?
Well, if you have any medications you take regularly, make sure you have enough on hand to last several days. And don't forget your pets. Make sure they have enough food, water, and any medications they might need too.
Right, because Fido can't just, run to the store if things go south.
Oh.
Are there any other specific hazards we should be aware of with this current bomb cyclone, besides the obvious wind and rain?
Well, one hazard that folks often overlook is downed power lines. After a storm, it's really important to be extra cautious around any downed lines.
Yeah.
Always assume they're live and stay well clear. Report them to your local utility company immediately.
Good point. And speaking of downed power lines, that's a good reminder to have a plan in place in case of power outages. Charge your devices beforehand, have flashlights and batteries ready, and if you have a generator, make sure it's working properly.
Absolutely. And think about things like how will you stay warm if the power goes out, especially if it's cold outside. Have extra blankets on hand and consider alternative heating sources. But of course, always use caution and follow safety guidelines when using things like space heaters or fireplaces.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've got understanding bomb cyclones, comparing this current storm to the 62 Columbus Day storm, preparing for the impacts, even thinking about staying safe during power outages. But I think it's important to remember that these storms can also have an emotional impact, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So what advice would you give to our listeners who might be feeling anxious or stressed about this current bomb cyclone?
Well, it's important to acknowledge those feelings and to seek support if you need it. Talking to friends and family can be really helpful. Or you might consider reaching out to a mental health professional.
Yeah.
There's no shame in seeking help when you need it.
So important. It's easy to get caught up in the physical preparations, but taking care of your mental and emotional well-being is just as crucial.
Right.
And, everyone reacts differently to these events. There's no right or wrong way to feel. Just be kind to yourself
Yeah,
and allow yourself to process what's happened.
exactly. We're all in this together, and it's important to support each other through these challenging times.
Well said. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to the 1962 Columbus Day storm one last time. We've talked about its intensity, the impacts, and the lessons we can learn. But is there anything else that stands out to you about this storm? Anything that makes it particularly unique or noteworthy?
One thing that I find particularly fascinating is that both the Columbus Day storm and this current bomb cyclone formed in a similar way, with the remnants of a typhoon merging with a mid-latitude storm system.
That's a really interesting connection. So even though these storms are, decades apart, there's a link in their origins.
There is, and it just highlights the interconnectedness of, weather patterns across the globe. What happens in one part of the world can have a ripple effect on weather thousands of miles away.
It's a powerful thought. And it really underscores that global nature of climate change and the need for international cooperation to address it. But we've covered so much ground already. I'm eager to hear your final thoughts on what all of this means for the future. We'll be back in just a moment for the final part of our deep dive to wrap up this fascinating discussion. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about these amazing Pacific Northwest storms, learned about what makes a bomb cyclone so powerful, heard some incredible stories from that 1962 Columbus Day storm.
And we talked about how we can prepare for these kinds of events, both in the short term and thinking about the long-term impacts of climate change.
Exactly. So, we've covered a lot of ground, but I keep thinking about the bigger picture here. What can we learn from these powerful storms, both the one happening right now and that historic one back in '62? What does it all mean for us here in the Pacific Northwest? What does it mean for the future?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? These storms, especially seeing them happen more often, really force us to think about climate change and, how it's affecting our weather.
So are we looking at a future where these intense storms, these bomb cyclones, become the new normal here in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, it's tough to say for certain, but the trends are definitely suggesting that. We need to be prepared for a future with more extreme weather events, and that means taking action on multiple fronts.
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of actions are we talking about? What can we actually do to get ready for that kind of future?
Well, for starters, we need to keep investing in scientific research,
Mm,
to understand these storms better and to improve our forecasting. The better we can predict these storms, the better we can prepare and respond.
that makes sense.
Hmm.
Early warnings can save lives. And the more we know about these storms, the more prepared we'll be.
Right. And then we need to think about infrastructure, making sure our communities are more resilient, to withstand these kinds of events.
Okay, so what, like stronger power grids? Or better roads and bridges?
Yeah, things like that. Reinforced bridges, updated building codes to handle stronger winds. It's not just reacting to the storms, it's changing the way we build and live to be able to withstand them.
Right, adapting to the changing climate.
Exactly. We need to be thinking more about disaster risk reduction rather than just disaster response. And that takes a long-term strategy. It's going to require governments, businesses, individuals all working together.
That sounds like a pretty big task.
Yeah.
What about us, though? What can individuals do to prepare? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these huge problems.
Don't underestimate the power of individual action. Even small changes can add up over time. Reducing your carbon footprint, supporting policies that address climate change, even getting involved in community preparedness efforts. All of these things contribute to a more resilient future.
Yeah. And on a more practical level, having those emergency kits ready, knowing your evacuation routes, those are all things we can do right now.
Absolutely. Individual preparedness is crucial. It gives people more control over their safety and well-being during these events.
Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about these incredible Pacific Northwest storms, both past and present. And, you've given us a lot to think about in terms of how to prepare and what we can do, even as individuals, to address climate change.
It's been great to be here. These are definitely challenging issues, but knowledge is power. The more we understand, the better equipped we are for the future.
Before we wrap up, is there any final thought you want to leave our listeners with? Something to think about as we watch this storm make its way to the coast?
As we learn to adapt to these more intense weather events, it really begs the question, what are the limits of adaptation? At what point do we need to make bigger changes to how we live and interact with our environment? It's a tough question, but it's one we need to start asking now.
Yeah, that's something to really think about. It's a good reminder that, yeah, we can and should prepare for these storms, but we also need to be thinking about how to live sustainably as our climate continues to change. Well, listeners, we hope this deep dive has helped you understand these storms better and maybe even inspired you to take some action, both individually and as a community. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep those brains buzzing.